Howdy folks, I've been getting quite a number of queries recently about an article on the internet that seems to be trending. The article appeared originally in a California newspaper called the Colfax Record, and it was authored by an individual using what appears to be the pen name Thomas Paine. The article concerns the question of whether or not same-sex unions were ever a Christian rite. That is, a ritual that the Christian church used to solemnize same-sex unions. And the article begins by discussing an icon that today is in Kiev, but that originally came from St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, which the author erroneously says is in Israel. It's not, it's actually in Egypt. After describing the icon, which features two saints with an image of Jesus between them, the author then breathlessly asks, "Is the icon suggesting that a gay wedding is being sanctified by Christ himself? The idea seems shocking." Shocking isn't the term I'd use. I'd say completely without foundation. The icon in question is of two early Christian martyrs, Sergius and Bacchus. They were soldiers, and they were martyred around the year AD 303 during the reign of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. There is no indication that they were homosexual, much less that they were married to each other. There are some texts, some church texts, written centuries later that talk about the love they had for one another. But it's a mistake characteristic of our own age to try to read any description of love between two people of the same sex as if it must be homosexual. That's something that our own culture has regrettably fallen into by failing to recognize the way that other ages would speak in profound and moving ways of the brotherly love and the spiritual love that two people could share regardless of their sex, and that has not even a hint of homosexuality. In this case, the love that Sergius and Bacchus shared was obviously of the brotherly and or spiritual kind. And that's clearly what these texts mean, because they're church texts. And if you read Christian literature of this age or any other, you'll find very strong condemnations of homosexual behavior. So the idea that church texts would be extolling these two people as homosexual lovers is just nuts. The author of the article goes on to say, contrary to myth, Christianity's concept of marriage has not been set in stone since the days of Christ, but is constantly evolved as a concept and ritual. Professor John Boswell, the late chairman of Yale University's History Department, discovered that in addition to heterosexual marriage ceremonies in the ancient Christian church liturgical documents, there were also ceremonies called the Office of Same-Sex Union and the Order for Uniting Two Men. These claims were made in the book Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe by John Boswell, the late head of Yale University's History Department. Unfortunately, he wasn't a neutral, unbiased scholar. He himself was homosexual, and he spent a great deal of his literary output seeking to justify and promote homosexuality. One could turn to any number of sources for an appraisal of his work, but the one I'd like to look at is an analysis offered by Professor Robin Darling-Young, a associate professor at Catholic University of America, where she teaches early Christian history. Even the most cursory examination of Boswell's documentation exposes the way he has struggled to force a group of documents to conform to his conclusions. Despite its facade of scholarship, the book is studded with unwarranted a priori assumptions, with arguments from silence, and with dubious, or in some cases, outrageously false translations of critical terms. And Boswell's insouciance, that means carelessness, about historical accuracy would be unacceptable in an undergraduate paper. She concludes her review by saying, all in all then, this book does not begin to accomplish what it set out to do. The reviews, after the early burst of hopeful publicity, have been notably skeptical, even from sources one would expect to be favorable. Indeed, the author's painfully strained effort to recruit Christian history in support of the homosexual cause that he favors is not only a failure, but an embarrassing one. I'd like to give an example of an outrageously false translation that Boswell makes in his book. You'll recall that the author of the Colfax Report piece had said Boswell had discovered ceremonies called the Office of Same-Sex Union and the Order for Uniting Two Men. These translations are completely false, as is immediately obvious if you look at the original languages here. For example, the Greek word for this kind of rite is adelphopoiesis. And if you know anything about Greek, as soon as you hear that, you realize the grave problems for what Boswell is claiming. It's a compound of two other Greek words, adelphos, which means brother, and poiein, which means to make. So adelphopoiesis is the act of making brothers. Now, that right there makes it clear this is not a marriage. If it were, for one thing, it would be the ordinary marriage ceremony, and it's not. It's a special ceremony to make people brothers. And while it's possible there are different kinds of brotherhood that people can acquire, they aren't sexual, because you don't have sex with your brother. And nobody in Christian history has proposed legitimizing that particular form of incest or any other. So the fact that these ceremonies are meant to make people brothers is something that has to be understood completely differently. Now, different forms of brotherly adoption could occur. It could be legal adoption, it could be the formation of an alliance, it could be the solemnizing of a friendship, it could be a kind of spiritual brotherhood, but it's certainly not sexual. And the fact that Boswell was willing to make this kind of outrageous mistranslation shows the lengths that he was willing to go to in order to twist original documents to the service of his agenda. There are things like this today as well, such as in our own culture, the custom that is sometimes used of becoming blood brothers. There's also something else today that shows just how wrong Boswell was, and that's the fact that these very same ceremonies continue to exist and continue to be used in some parts of the Christian world. Professor Robin Darling Young, for example, has herself taken part in one. In her article, which you can find online at my website at jimmyakin.com/Boswell, she recounts a trip that she and a colleague took in 1985. They visited Syriac Christian communities in eastern Turkey and in Syria, and they visited Jerusalem. During the course of our travels, we paid a visit to St. Mark's Monastery in Jerusalem, the residence of the Syrian Orthodox Archbishop. There, our host, Archbishop Dionysius Benam Yahweh, remarked that since we had survived the rigors of Syria and eastern Turkey in amicable good humor, we two women must be good friends indeed. Would we like to be joined as sisters the next morning after the bishop's Sunday liturgy in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? After the liturgy, the bishop had us join our right hands together, and he wrapped them in a portion of his garment. He pronounced a series of prayers over us, told us that we were united as sisters, and admonished us not to quarrel. So these ceremonies continue to exist and be used in our own day. They're not sexual, they're not homosexual marriages, and instead they are a profound recognition of the spiritual love and friendship that can exist between two people in a completely platonic manner.